Welcome back to another Stranger Things edition of Let's Theorise with Pies. Today I'm talking about the hate that Max gets for Season 3, and while I think some complaints are completely justified, some of them are just ridiculous. I've ended up defending Max in many a long Reddit exchange, so I decided to bring my Max ramble over to YouTube in the hope that it will curb my urge to write an essay in response to every vaguely negative post about Max in the future. And I'm making a leek and mustard pie in honour of Sadie and Millie's ketchup and mustard song, which if you know, you know. I'm going to break this down into two sections. First of all, I'm going to deal with the popular complaints about Max and why I disagree with them. Then I'm going to address some of my issues with the way that Max was written in Season 3. Problem 1. Toxic advice. Before people come at me, I'll start out by saying that the advice given by Max definitely isn't the best advice she could give. When Elle came to her and said that Mike had lied to her, she suggested giving him the silent treatment until he apologised for the lie, and if he didn't apologise, she should dump him. Of course, it would be a far healthier course of action to sit down with your partner and have a well-reasoned adult conversation where you both openly discuss what's happened and come to a mutual resolution. But Max isn't a well-reasoned adult, and neither are Elle or Mike. They're teenagers. And teenagers aren't generally filled with the best advice or advanced emotional maturity, particularly regarding relationships. Max is also more likely to have unhealthy relationship role models to be working from than the other characters do, given that her parents seem to have had a really messy divorce, and then her mother married a violent, abusive, controlling pillock. Many of the fans are very aware of this, and some are not really mad that Max gave bad advice. They're mad that Max's bad advice worked. The impression I get is that they wanted consequences to Max's actions. They wanted the advice to backfire, to show that it's bad advice, and they wanted an apology from Max for it. My belief is that if it had backfired, Max would have apologised, but as it worked, she had no reason to question her behaviour, to reevaluate her approach to relationships and apologise for her suggestions. An apology for this during Season 3 would have felt like a forced, confusing after-school special, because while I can understand the desire not to be advocating for playing these kind of games in relationships and thinking that it sends an unhealthy message to teens, I'd prefer to see something that somewhat resembles the teenage experience rather than watch a show with characters that are way too self-aware to be believable. And while it was terrible advice, it was a plan that had worked for Max in the past. Both the silent treatment and the dumping technique have been successful for her a bunch of times. So even though she exists within an unhealthy relationship model, the advice she gives Elle seems well-meaning. At this point in the argument, I'm generally met with, "But it was bad advice, that's why it should have failed. Mike should have stood up for himself." But I can fully understand why the show didn't take that path. If Mike had been indignant about Elle breaking up with him and Elle had been the one to have to apologise and ask to get back together, it would have put him in a much more negative light. As most of the people who make this argument are big Mike fans who are tired of having to defend Mike's actions, I don't think they're considering how much fuel that would have added to the Mike-hating fire. It would mean that he'd lied to Elle, then, when she's rightfully upset about it, he doubles down on his lie, so she breaks up with him and he gets annoyed that she doesn't resolve the situation by talking about it like an adult, even though he just did the exact same thing. And then she has to go and grovel for his forgiveness? In that situation, even if Mike apologised for his bad behaviour as well, it would still feel like Elle was being punished for Hopper's bad behaviour, for being hurt that Mike lied, and for listening to bad advice from a friend. And while Elle should have apologised for spying on the boys, she shouldn't really have to apologise for the rest of those things. So unless they went down the route of removing all the drama and resolving problems with a polite conversation, the conflict would always end up with one party getting the short straw. And even though Mike seemed to get it in Season 3, he also came out of the situation seeming like a much nicer guy than he would have been if he'd got the long straw option. Problem 2 is her lack of respect for the rules. Some fans were annoyed at Max for endangering Elle in Season 3 by taking her to the mall and by encouraging her to use her powers. And this is a legitimate concern. Where I think that it goes too far is when people start saying that she doesn't care about what happens to Elle or that she's being malicious. I don't think that Max took the rules seriously enough, but I find it easy to justify her perspective. She's been controlled by Billy and her stepfather, who impose a lot of rules on her, like when Billy tried to tell her not to hang around with Lucas for her own safety. She's used to men being controlling and rules being stupid, so it makes sense that she'd see Elle's life through that lens. From Max's perspective, the gate's been closed for 9 months, so that isn't a threat. The lab's moved out of town, so they're not a threat. And it's a mall. The idea that a superhero girl wouldn't be safe at the mall seemed like a stupid rule to her, so she ignored it. And the fact that their trip to the mall was without incident will only have boosted her confidence that the rules weren't that important and they were just there to control Elle. I think that she's projecting a lot of her own issues onto her new friend. This is one of the reasons why I find it very hard to see her behaviour as out of character, as has been suggested. Based on everything from season 2, a desire to rebel against unnecessary rules imposed by the controlling men in her life is very on brand. It doesn't surprise me that she would assume the worst about the men in Elle's life and the rules that she has to follow, even though those rules actually are for her benefit. And while we're on projection, I think that a lot of her attitude about Mike was based on irritation at Lucas. From Elle and Max's first conversation in season 3, I got the impression that Max was in a mood with Lucas. Her immediate assumption was that Mike and Lucas were off together somewhere, which I took to mean that she'd also been left out of plans for that day. Her swift move to the accusation of boyfriends lie all the time seems to be based on her own relationship rather than being a judgment specifically about Mike. In later scenes, there seems to also be a really strong suggestion that Max had also broken up with Lucas. Max says to Elle, "I guarantee you, him and Lucas are like totally wallowing in self-pity and misery and going, 'Oh, I hope they take us back.' And Will says they broke up with you when Mike and Lucas are talking about the girls. If I could just ask them one question, it would be whether they filmed a breakup scene in season 3 that was cut, or at least if it was written, because the dialogue really reads like they broke up at some point. And if they did, it would really explain why she was going in extra hard on the boys at certain times in the season. Problem 3. People are annoyed about the representation of the girls' friendship, the shopping, the talking about boys, the lack of nerdy interests. It's been described more than once as a shallow and stereotypical portrayal of teenage girls, and some have accused the Duffer Brothers of not being good at writing teen girls, but I completely disagree. The mall was a big new location this year. The whole gang, minus Elle, is shown sneaking into the movies there in the first episode, something they seem to do regularly based on Steve's reaction. And both the girls and the boys spend the day at the mall, so it isn't being shown as what girls do, it's being shown as what all teenagers do. The boys also spend a lot of time talking about the girls this season, but we don't question how shallow their relationships are because of it. And even though the girls are generalising and complaining about boys, they're also talking about one of the only things that they actually have in common, which is their mutual friends. They also showed Max introducing Elle to Wonder Woman and the girls trying to solve a mystery by themselves, but generally that's brushed aside when people are busy talking about the totally out-of-character, ultra-girly day out. Problem 4 is Mike. Another frequent theory is that Max still dislikes Mike for not wanting her in the party in season 2, and that she's enacting some kind of revenge by breaking up him and his girlfriend. But there's nothing in the show to suggest that this is true. In the first episode, when Mike and Elle decide to peel off from the group and hang out alone, Max defends them, saying that it's romantic. Given that she's barely friends with Elle at this point, and everyone else in the party is annoyed at them leaving, it makes no sense that she would defend them if she hated Mike. There's another contingent that don't claim that Max was intentionally breaking Mike and Elle up because she hated Mike, but still seem to think that she's completely to blame for their breakup and wanted it to happen. Again, I don't think this is supported by the show. Max wanted Mike to apologise to Elle. The dumping was just a secondary attack if the silent treatment wasn't successful at eliciting the apology. And even the dumping seemingly wasn't treated like a permanent move. Max and Lucas have broken up 5 times. Each time he tried to win her back, and each time it worked. In Max's experience, a dumping is just a way to express that they need to work really hard to win you back over. And although an unhealthy pattern to get into, I don't think any part of her was actually trying to properly break up this couple. The majority of the popular complaints section was related to Mike, and that's because the main arguments against Max are made by people who love Mike, who think that someone other than him needs to be blamed for what happened in season 3. Whereas I'm of the belief that no one should carry the blame for the events of season 3. We don't need to tear down the other characters in an attempt to defend our favourites. All of them are slightly flawed characters, but good people, and none of them need to be hated, particularly not the children. Partly because it's ridiculous to hate a teenage character for acting like a teenager, and partly because that hate eventually gets back to the actual children who are playing those roles, and that's really upsetting. Now we're into the real problems with season 3 and the missed opportunities for Max to grow. Season 3 was definitely pushing more of a girls are always right narrative than any of the previous seasons. It reared its head in the Nancy and Jonathan storyline when they both realised that they were in the wrong after their fight in the car. Jonathan was disregarding the sexism she was facing at work, and she was disregarding his financial situation. She starts to apologise for the way that she acted, although not for risking his job, and Jonathan stops her and takes all responsibility. And because Nancy was right about the rats and Mrs. Driscoll being infected, her reaction to this was just, "I just look forward to you never doubting me again." It showed up again in Mike and Elle's reconciliation. He apologised for a lot of his behaviour, although he never actually apologised for lying, and she didn't apologise for hers. She should have apologised for spying on the boys, but she didn't take any responsibility for it. This season seems to have a lot of people apologising, but not really for the things that they actually did wrong, and the women righteously accept these apologies. While I think that they're trying to push a strong woman narrative where the ladies get the apologies they're due, they failed to remember that the girls actually have to be in the right to pull off a girls are always right narrative. Otherwise you end up making the women look like they're unable to see their own flaws or take responsibility for their actions. Although I don't believe that it would have made much sense for Max to apologise for her advice to Elle at this point in time, I think that she could have taken a little more responsibility for her actions across the series, particularly for spying on people with Elle. Even though it was Elle's idea, she shifted the blame off herself and onto her friend a little too quickly for my liking. So, even though it fits her character not to apologise, she suffers from the lack of responsibility taken by the rest of the women this season. She gets lumped in with the other characters who should have apologised, and perhaps if some of them had taken more responsibility, people wouldn't be so annoyed about the girls being right even when they're wrong narrative. On to her underdeveloped relationship with Billy. I mostly covered this in my Billy video, so watch that to hear my full argument and a possible fix, but essentially I think that they blew past some really important development for both Max and Billy. Failing to show us any scenes of them together in season 3 before he gets flayed was a huge missed opportunity. We don't know why Max's attitude to Billy has changed since season 2. We don't get to see how their relationship has progressed. We're expected to believe that she doesn't consider Billy to be a physical threat, even though the last time we saw them together on screen, he was choking Lucas and beating Steve unconscious. Just a scene or two between the two of them could have fixed this. It could have humanised Billy and given Max more reason to mourn him. I would be happy to see them delve into that relationship in flashbacks in season 4, but I fear that we won't be seeing Billy again. And their season 2 relationship was really captivating, so the lack of interaction in season 3 felt like a real letdown. This ties into my last point, which I didn't explore in my Billy video as it's more of a Max issue. The show entirely glosses over the fact that Billy is almost definitely going to die. I know that initially they'd hoped to boil the Mind Flayer out of him in the sauna, which obviously didn't work because Billy was far stronger than Will was in season 2, and rather than having an entire gang of kids and adults against one vaguely cooperative flayed child, they had a bunch of young teens and Elle against a very uncooperative superhuman. This was the point where they could have started peppering in Max's fears that he wouldn't survive, but they didn't. As it is, they didn't really explore Max's fear that Billy might die until episode 8. When Nancy pulls a gun off one of the Russian soldiers to use for protection, and Max says, "You're going to kill him, aren't you?" But by this time, it was already a moot point. Up until they discovered that the gate was open and that they could kill the monster by closing it, there was still a possibility that they may have found a solution that included saving Billy. But by this point in the plot, it doesn't make a difference if Nancy shoots him. They already accepted that he would be a sacrifice the second they agreed to close the gate. Unlike in season 2, they don't discuss the fact that closing the gate will kill the infected people. They just talk about how it will kill the monster. Which is probably because the majority of the Flayed are already dead, but they just ignore Billy entirely, which I think is another huge missed opportunity for Max's character. She could have objected to the plan, as it meant her step-sibling would die, which could have caused tension between her and the rest of the group. Or she could have begrudgingly accepted that it was their only choice, giving her a juicy guilt subplot next season when she blames herself for not fighting for his life. Even if she wasn't allowed to have a say in the decision, just the awareness that this choice was going to kill her stepbrother, it would have been an interesting dilemma to show. The most frustrating thing about episode 8, when Max finally considers Billy's possible death, is that they don't even talk about it at that point. Nancy and Will persuade her that they won't shoot him unless they have to. Surely it must have occurred to one of the three that he already has a target on his back and only minutes to live. They had multiple opportunities to have this realization dawn on Max, but they don't give her character the screen time to explore it. Instead, they went with her seeming to be shocked when he died, which I think was a far less interesting choice. In conclusion, I love Max. She gives terrible advice, she's got super unhealthy relationship ideas, and she doesn't apologise easily. But I love her. She feels like a real teenager, and I don't see any of her behaviour coming from a vindictive place. Her advice to Elle may be awful advice, but it has worked for Max in the past, so it seems like she's truly trying to help. And she's flippant about the rules made for Elle's safety because she sees Elle as a superhero who can more than take care of herself, which is certainly misguided, but I don't think she was intentionally endangering her. Max also has very controlling men in her family who say they're imposing rules for her safety, so her belief that these rules might be overly strict and made to control Elle could come from her own experience. Overall, I'd classify her behaviour in Season 3 as misguided, but well-intentioned. I really hope that next season they'll give her some more meaty storylines, though I wish she'd been more aware of Billy's impending death in Season 3. I think they'll still delve into some guilt and mourning next season. Hopefully it will give her a chance to grow as a person, to be less hard-headed and more thoughtful to others, but I suspect there may be quite a bit of lashing out before we get to that point, and if that does happen, I really hope that they give Max a proper arc, giving people a reason to empathise with her, because she has a lot of potential, and I don't want to see her just get sidelined as part of someone else's story again next season. I hope this made a few Max haters rethink their issues with her, though I doubt it did, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you hate her for reasons not mentioned or disagree with my opinion. Hope you like the pie. Thanks for watching. Bye!